Well, hello everyone. This is going to be another one of those family history videos that I want to make for the sake of my grandchildren, and the rest of you can listen in if you care to. So, welcome to my hill. It's not really my hill. My brother farms the farm, but I did grow up here, and I lived for the first 25 years of my life here. And I remember climbing this hill even late at night with my dog Laddie, and thinking about all the things that adolescents think about as they try to find their niche in this world. But this story today is a much bigger story. It's the story of how my people came to this land called William Penn's Manor in the early 1700s. Here's a fan chart I did about 50 years ago, which will give us some perspective in our place in this story. You can see here I am the 10th generation on this side of the Atlantic. My father's name was Arthur Charles, and he raised his family here on this farm. He grew up right across the Donerville Road on his father's farm. His father was Ivan Charles, and he had one brother, Ivan Jr. And they went to school in this one-room schoolhouse called Harmony Hall at the corner of Charlestown and Donerville Road. Ivan grew up on his father's farm just next door on the same lane, and his name was David Charles. David was the oldest son of Christian Charles. David grew up on the adjoining farm to the east. Actually, Christian Charles was the fourth generation of Charleses to farm this land. Christian's father was John Jr., who was the son of John Sr., who was the son of Jacob, who purchased the farm in 1797 from the Benner family. Jacob was the younger son of Henry Charles, who was the immigrant from the old country in 1737. Henry moved his family here on this farm on Habecker Church Road from Germantown, Philadelphia, sometime around 1744. So what do we know about Henry Charles? Actually, his name was not Henry Charles, even though that name is used for the graveyard memorial. Henry Charles is actually an English name. His real name was German, Heinrich Karli. He and his wife Anna Habecker, along with Anna's brother Christian Habecker, migrated from Massacre, France in 1737, according to historian Robert Charles and Don Jacobs, who wrote this wonderful little booklet on the family history of his wife, Anna Ruth Charles. The question everyone asks is, why would they leave their extended family and move to the New World? We know it was a difficult time for Anabaptist believers. Anabaptist means they were baptized again. It was like saying their first baptism wasn't valid, so they needed to do it a second time. One could ask, well, that sounds silly. Why would anyone get excited about that? However, baptism was akin to becoming a citizen of the state. So by being rebaptized or refusing to baptize their children was an act of tyranny against the state. It was like denying their citizenship. They refused to take up their sword against the enemies of the state, and for this they suffered greatly. Some were put in prison, and some were even killed. So many moved from their towns in Switzerland to more tolerant towns like Massacre. Even though they could not own property and they lived as second-class citizens, they were still happy they could be true to their convictions of what it meant to follow Jesus. This was probably the story of Heinrich Karli because their family was not native to Massacre. Here in Massacre, they worked as weavers, certainly not wealthy, but they could survive. There is a family Bible stored at the Mennonite Archives given by Heinrich Karli the Sr. that he purchased in 1712. It was already 50 years old at that time, so it was a used book, but it's still, a Bible was the most expensive item to purchase in the 1700s. Some would think that this would mean that they were wealthy, but that's really not the case. But it does demonstrate how highly these folks prioritized the scriptures in their life. I'm sure that this Bible represents a huge sacrifice for them at that time. I think even poor people can scrape together enough money to buy something they really care about. During this time in Massacre, news circulated that William Penn was inviting German pacifists to his colony in Philadelphia. This invitation was really attractive to many people, including Heinrich. So many responded to this invitation. Heinrich and his family joined a total of 437 people to board a British vessel called the Charming Nancy and set sail for the New World. Amazingly, Heinrich even packed their prized family Bible with their luggage. They successfully arrived in Philadelphia October the 8th in 1737. You were supposed to have documents from England, but we are told only about a third of these German emigrants had proper documents. The rest just boarded the boat with a commitment to work and pay off their fare when they landed. This was Heinrich's situation. They lived 7 years in Germantown, Philadelphia to raise funds. According to historian Carolyn Charles Wanger, because they had no documents, it took 16 years for them to become naturalized citizens of this colony of Pennsylvania. Between 1727 and 1775, about 65,000 German immigrants landed in Philadelphia. This influx of German people was really distressing to the English folks living here. As early as 1717, William Keith, who was Lieutenant Governor of Pennsylvania, complained that great numbers of foreigners from Germany, strangers to our language and constitution, having lately been imported into this province, daily dispersed themselves immediately after landing without producing any certificates from whence they came. Even Ben Franklin was disturbed. In 1751 he wrote, "Why should the Palatine Boers, meaning Germans, be suffered to swarm into our settlements and by herding together establish their language and manners to the exclusion of ours? Why should Pennsylvania, founded by the English, become a colony of aliens who will shortly be so numerous as to Germanize us instead of our Anglifying them? And they will never adopt our language or customs any more than they can acquire our complexion." I wonder if this pervasive feeling among the English toward German people is why Heinrich changed his name to an English name, Henry Charles. Did he feel he might be better accepted or fit in better with an English name? We'll never know, but it's fun to think about. So after he worked off his debt, or maybe gathered some cash together, he was able to move to this plot of ground just over the hill from where I grew up. On this map, it is marked with the number 2. Today that plot is bordered by the Habecker Church Road and the Donerville Road. Henry's wife Anna had a brother Christian Habecker, who purchased the lot just west of Henry's plot. Then about 20 years later, in 1762, a deed was given by the Penns for a church to be built. First, a log house was built as a church meeting house, and it became known as Habecker Mennonite Church, where the neighbors came to worship. The Charles family cemetery was located on Henry's farm very close to the road, and when they straightened the road in 1920, the gravestones were moved to the Habecker Mennonite Church Cemetery. The question I often think about is, did our family immigrants have any connection with Native Americans, called the Conestoga Indians, who lived here? The Native Americans had a long history living here along the Susquehanna River. My source for almost all of this information is from Darvin Martin in his book, A Clash of Cultures. It's just an excellent book on our early history here in Lancaster County, and you can still buy his book at Mennonite Life just east of Lancaster. According to Darvin, our natives have their roots from Asia, in Mongolia. They migrated across the Bering Strait 10,000 years ago. Eventually, they even reached the east coast of North America. Some of our earliest settlements here in what we call WashingtonBurough seem to date around 1000 AD. They were part of a larger people group called the Algonquin people. Later, another language group from the Seneca tribe in New York moved down the Susquehanna River Valley and came to dominate the region. They became known as the Susquehannocks. Captain John Smith was the governor of the struggling colony at Jamestown around 1608, and he sailed up the bay to meet these Susquehannocks. And he was able to meet with 60 Susquehannocks at one time. He was so impressed with them. John Smith writes, "They seemed like giants of men, and so healthy and well fed." The natives provided him with maize or corn, enough to keep he and his people from starving. It is estimated that 3,000 or more natives lived here in WashingtonBurough at that time. However, the native population was not immune to the new pandemics such as measles and smallpox, which they were exposed to by the Europeans. Throughout the 17th century, their populations declined. It was a stressful time for the natives. Some moved westward into York County, and some moved to Maryland. It is understood for 20 or 30 years there was no natives living here in Manor Township. However, in 1690, a group of 200 Susquehannocks from Maryland returned to WashingtonBurough, and these folks became known as the Conestoga Indians. These were the natives that William Penn made friends with. It is said that the natives trusted William Penn. In 1701, a peace treaty was signed describing the English and the Indian as having one body with two parts. Later, in 1717, 1 year before his death, William Penn promised 16,000 acres of his manor as hunting ground for the Conestoga Indians. This land was bordered by the 40th parallel in the north, or essentially the Charlestown Road, east to the Little Conestoga, south to the Conestoga, and west to the Susquehanna. However, this promise was not respected very well by squatters who lived illegally in the manor. In addition, William Penn's sons did not follow their father's Quaker convictions. In 1737, the same year our people landed in Philadelphia, surveys on Penn's manor reduced the 16,000 acres to just 414 acres, reserved for the Conestoga Indians, identified on this map with the blue line. 7 years later, in 1744, our people moved to this land. I tried to imagine what this land looked like. Was it all forested? We know that the natives had cleared land on their own at different places for their own garden plots. I wonder if our people inherited some of those native clearings to grow their crops. Did they ever have occasion to meet the natives? Were they friendly toward each other? Or maybe they were even fearful of each other. Could they communicate? They only lived about 5 miles across the fields from their village. One would think they almost had to have some contact, even as William Penn did way back in 1701. I wonder if my people were so focused on simply surviving that they had no time for meeting with natives. Or did they simply ignore their native neighbors? According to Darvin Martin, there were some contact between native and European. He writes that the natives felt trapped within their reservation, fearful of carrying guns to hunt beyond their 414 acres. Sometimes the natives attempted to sell their handmade baskets and bowls to people in the community. However, after reports of Indian attacks on the frontier began to circulate, people from Lancaster began to feel threatened when the natives ventured outside their reservation. Some people were concerned. A Quaker justice by the name of James Wright and a German Mennonite named Abraham Herr lived near Indiantown, and they were told by the government to supply the native community with flour and other things. However, disaster struck December 13, 1763. This was 1 year after our church at the Habecker Mennonite Church opened in 1762. A private militia set out from Harrisburg, rode down River Road, and attacked the village the next morning at dawn. Only 6 people were home at the time, and they killed all of them with tomahawks and guns. They were surprised and angry that not all the natives were home. After the massacre, they were cold, so they stopped in at a neighbor Quaker, Tommy Wright's family farm, to get warm. Darvin writes, a young boy went outside to check their horses and saw bloody tomahawks hanging from their saddles. He came back in and reported that they had the gun of Christie, who was his friend, his own age, from the village. Quaker Tommy Wright realized what was happening, and he informed the gang that the Indian village was under government protection. They replied, "No government has the right to protect the heathen. Joshua was ordered to drive the heathen out of the land. Do you believe the scriptures? If you don't, we don't have anything else to say to you." The remaining 14 Conestoga Indians were traumatized when they returned to their village and saw the massacre. The people in leadership at Lancaster decided to protect them by checking them into the county jail here in Lancaster, what is now Fulton Opera House. But then 2 weeks later, while many people in Lancaster were enjoying a Christmas program, this militia returned from Harrisburg, broke into a jail, and killed all 14 of the remaining Indians. This plaque on the back wall of the foundation of the Fulton Opera House at Water Street helps us remember this awful day. While some were upset with this tragedy, no one in this militia were charged for the massacre. So this is the end of any Native presence here in Manor Township. But this is not the end of the story. Let me fast forward 250 years to our own story here at church. When we heard that the Church World Service needed sponsors for Karen-speaking immigrants from Burma, we had no idea how they would impact our congregation. We simply saw it as our responsibility to do what we can to help provide a roof over their head and food on the table, and help navigate the medical, school, and work world. However, it became a most meaningful experience, and it gave new life and purpose to our small congregation. It was exciting to see the families, first of all, find meaningful work, struggle to learn the language, and eventually become citizens. And now most of the families are homeowners. When they first came, they would tell us, "We don't know where home is." However, almost all would say, "Today, this is now home." I only began to connect this current story to my own family immigrant history about 4 or 5 years later, as I attended some of our friends' New Year's celebrations. They really emphasized their history as beginning in Mongolia. They tell their story every New Year with many ethnic songs. As their ancestors spread out from Mongolia, they eventually landed in their promised land, which is the Karen state of Burma. I thought, well, isn't this interesting? Our native people have to be the ancient cousins of these people who have come to worship with us. Our history is such a difficult story. We can't change our history, but maybe, just maybe, we can redeem our history by welcoming their ancient cousins into this world we inhabit. As they once again grow beans, maize, tomatoes, potatoes on this soil where their ancient cousins cultivated, even domesticated these crops, and actually sharing them with these new vegetables with the Europeans. When I told this story to my brother, he thought my idea was a bit of a stretch. Well, he said, if you're going to say that, you might as well say everyone is related. Of course, he's right, but that is my point. As political winds blow that influence us negatively toward others, it's important for us to remember who I am. I am the descendant of displaced, undocumented, even poor immigrant people living on land that was occupied by others for 1,000 years. And then, I should say, promised to others by William Penn, but fraudulently taken away from them, making room for my own people, allowing us to prosper now for almost 300 years. Just maybe we are redeeming our history. Growing up in the church, I often heard our older people say, God's mercy is new every day. And when I think of our own history here in this land, I certainly believe that to be true. And so it's so important that I extend that same mercy toward everyone else I meet, no matter where they come from. That's the word that I have for my grandchildren. Thanks for watching.